Welcome back to the deep dive. Today
Yeah.
we're going to talk about a feeling,
Yeah, a very specific feeling.
right? A specific feeling that I'm willing to bet practically every single man listening to this has felt at some point recently.
Oh, without a doubt.
It's that moment when you're just scrolling through the news, or maybe you're sitting in some mandatory HR seminar at work,
Right.
or even just watching a movie from 20 years ago and comparing it to one from today, and you just get this gnawing sense in the pit of your stomach.
It's like a glitch in the matrix feeling.
Exactly. It's that suspicion that standards are just dropping across the board,
Yeah.
that basic responsibilities evaporating, and that logic, like cold, hard, objective logic, is constantly being besieged by pure emotion.
It's the feeling that the game is rigged against you.
Right? The scoreboard is broken, and the referees are actively betting against your team.
And if you point it out, if you say anything, you're the one who gets a penalty.
Exactly. You feel like you're going crazy, looking around, wondering, am I the only one seeing this?
Yeah, it can be really isolating.
But today, we are going to dive into a source that attempts to validate that feeling. We're putting a name to the chaos by looking at an explosive new ebook.
It really is explosive.
It's titled Feminist Domestic Terrorism: Western Civilization in a Hostage Situation by Conrad Riker.
And let's be clear right off the bat here. The author isn't using the title as some kind of loose metaphor.
Right.
Riker isn't using the word terrorism as a buzzword. He's actually using it as a clinical definition for what he claims is happening.
Yeah, the book argues that we are living through this coordinated psychological dismantling of Western institutions.
And for anyone listening who wants to understand the history of how our institutions were captured, before we even get into the details, you need to hit that like and subscribe button right now.
Absolutely.
We are going to give you the high-level intel today, but you're going to want to buy this book by the end of the hour to get the full scope of what Riker is saying.
Yeah, you can go check out Feminist Domestic Terrorism by Conrad Riker on Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
Highly recommend picking it up to see the original source material for yourself.
Right, so looking at the premise, this book is essentially written as a field manual for the red-pilled manosphere audience.
Yeah, guys who know something is wrong but maybe don't quite have the vocabulary to fight it yet.
And Riker's core thesis is that none of this cultural shift is random noise. He calls it a gynocratic coup.
Which is a heavy claim.
It's a massive claim. He argues that Western civilization is in a literal hostage situation caused by female-coded leftism.
Now, as always on this deep dive, our goal here is impartial reporting. We're not taking sides or endorsing the politics.
Right, we're just laying out exactly what the author is arguing in the text, because it is a fascinating lens on modern culture.
Exactly. We're tracing the arguments he lays out, starting with this concept he calls the maternal mutation.
Let's start right there. How does a whole civilization get taken hostage, according to Riker?
So Riker argues that society has undergone this matriarchal mutation. He grounds this heavily in evolutionary biology.
Okay, so going back to basic human instinct.
Right. In a family unit, the maternal instinct is obviously a beautiful, completely necessary thing.
Yeah, it nurtures, it protects the vulnerable.
It ensures safety. If a toddler wanders near a hot stove, the mother intervenes to stop them from getting hurt. It's basic survival.
But Riker's argument is that this exact instinct has been weaponized, right?
Exactly. He says it's been scaled up from the family unit to the level of the state.
Which changes everything.
Entirely. Because when you apply a hyperprotective maternal instinct to a nation of hundreds of millions of adults, he argues it becomes a nightmare.
It stops being nurturing and just starts being suffocating.
Right. Instead of a mother protecting a baby from a sharp object, you have the government trying to protect grown men from words.
Or from ideas.
From risk itself. Riker paints this picture of a culture of safetyism where merit is totally replaced by the need to feel secure.
And he uses a really dark psychological analogy for this, doesn't he?
Yeah, he compares the modern state to a mother with Munchausen syndrome by proxy.
I mean, that is a jarring comparison. Munchausen is when someone fakes being sick for attention, right?
Right, and Munchausen by proxy is the abusive form of it. That's when a caregiver, usually a mother, deliberately invents an illness for her child.
Or actually makes the child sick on purpose.
Exactly, just to gain attention and sympathy from doctors and the community. She needs the child to be this helpless invalid so she can play the role of the saintly, suffering mother.
That is just twisted.
It's a horrific pathology. But Riker asks the reader to look at the state through that exact lens.
Look at the massive bureaucracy we have.
Right. He makes the case that if the government actually solved problems, like if they genuinely fixed poverty or inequality or whatever grievance is popular, what would happen to all those departments?
They would shrink. They'd lose their entire budget.
All those bureaucrats would be out of a job. So Riker says that just like the Munchausen mother, the state actually has a built-in incentive to keep the citizens sick.
It literally has to invent new traumas to justify its own existence.
Exactly. It has to find microaggressions in places where none exist. It has to declare that unconscious bias is this invisible pandemic everywhere.
So it keeps the citizenry as perpetual infants.
Fragile, traumatized, and totally dependent on the state for validation.
That is a terrifying frame, because it basically means the help they're offering is actually the poison.
Right, the help is the shackles.
Look.
And Riker connects this directly to the linguistic shift we've seen from the word equality to the word equity.
Which I think is a huge point. A lot of guys hear those two words and just assume they're synonyms.
Yeah, they sound so similar. You just think, oh, we just want things to be fair.
But Riker is screaming from the rooftops in this book that they are total opposites.
Total opposites. He defines equality as equal opportunity. It's the starting line.
We all line up, the gun goes off, whoever runs the fastest wins.
Which is the classic American meritocracy ethos. But equity, according to the book, is forcing an equal outcome at the finish line.
Right, and the only way to make sure everyone crosses the finish line at the exact same time is to cripple your fastest runners.
Exactly. Riker uses the example of studying. If I study for 10 hours and get an A, and you play video games and get an F, equity dictates that the system has failed.
So the system steps in and curves the grades until we both just get a C.
It's the participation trophy philosophy applied to the entire global economy.
And the book describes it as even worse than that. It calls it institutionalized covetousness.
Yeah, looking at someone who succeeded and telling them, you didn't build that, you stole it, and we are taking it back.
He calls it a revenge fantasy dressed up as fairness.
Now, what's interesting is Riker doesn't just say this is a modern phenomenon. He traces the historical roots back a long way.
Yeah, this part surprised me. He brings up the temperance movement from the late 19th and early 20th centuries.
Most people just think of that as church ladies who hated whiskey.
Right, I always just thought of it as a historical footnote about prohibition.
But the book frames the temperance movement as the literal dress rehearsal for modern feminist control.
He says it was the first time this maternal framing was successfully used to invade and dismantle male spaces. Let's break that down for the listener. What does he mean by male spaces in that context?
Think about the American saloon back then, or fraternal lodge. These were autonomous places men went to just be men, completely away from the oversight of women.
Right, the original man caves.
They drank, they smoked, they talked politics, they networked. It was their sphere.
And then the Women's Christian Temperance Union comes along.
Right, the WCTU. And Riker points out they didn't just advocate for sobriety from afar, they used aggressive agitation.
They physically invaded these spaces.
They would march right into saloons, singing hymns loudly, kneeling in prayer on the sawdust floors, actively shaming the men in public.
And they framed the whole thing as a maternal duty.
Exactly. The narrative was, we are protecting the home. We are protecting the innocent children from your drunkenness and your sins.
Which, as Riker points out, is a brilliant trap. Because who wants to be the guy arguing against protecting children?
Nobody. It's an unassailable moral high ground. They used their status as the moral, nurturing sex to completely raise male institutions to the ground.
And the book argues this is the exact prototype for what happens today.
Identify a male-dominated space. Maybe it's a corporate boardroom, or a video game community, or a comic book fandom.
Right.
Claim that it is somehow unsafe or toxic or exclusionary.
And then invaded to clean it up.
And once you're inside, you rewrite the rules of the space until the original men just leave.
It's a hostile takeover disguised as housekeeping.
Yes. And Riper digs deep into the psychology of the people who drive these takeovers. He connects this behavior to borderline personality disorder, or BPD.
Now, some listeners might hear that and think he's just throwing out insults.
Right, it sounds like name-calling.
But he actually cites data here, doesn't he?
He does. He cites CDC data and psychological studies showing that women are diagnosed with BPD at roughly twice the rate of men.
But he's not just trying to diagnose individuals. He's trying to diagnose the broader culture.
He's saying the culture itself has taken on the symptoms of borderline personality disorder.
So what does a borderline culture actually look like in practice?
Well, look at the classic symptoms of BPD. First is black and white thinking.
Right, no middle ground.
Exactly. You are either a perfect, flawless ally, or you are a literal Nazi. Nuance is completely dead.
Then you have the emotional volatility.
The screaming at the sky, the public meltdowns over incredibly minor infractions, and then there's the big one, which is fear of abandonment.
How does fear of abandonment translate into political behavior?
Look at phrases like silence is violence.
Oh, that makes perfect sense.
If you aren't actively validating me every single second, you are literally hurting me.
If you don't post a black square on your social media, you are erasing my existence.
It is a demand for constant, unceasing emotional validation from everyone around you. Riker argues that modern political correctness is just BPD symptoms written large across society.
And enforced by the HR department.
Exactly. It creates a society that prioritizes feelings over facts. We reject the concept of natural consequences.
Because in reality, if you act crazy, people just stop talking to you.
But in the Munchausen state, if you act crazy, we create a university department to validate your craziness and we force everyone else to applaud it.
Which transitions us perfectly into the second segment of the book, which Riker calls the weapons of war.
Right, because you cannot enforce a widespread delusion without strictly controlling the language people use.
If the sky is blue, but the state needs everyone to say the sky is green, they have to completely change the definitions of the words.
Riker refers to this as linguistic sabotage, or essentially feminist newspeak.
It's totally Orwellian. They take words that have warm, positive connotations that nobody in their right mind would oppose.
And they hollow them out entirely. They scoop out the dictionary definition and stuff a hostile political agenda inside the shell of the word.
Let's look at the big three he mentions: diversity, equity, and inclusion.
DEI. Let's start with diversity. To a normal person on the street, diversity just means a mix. A variety of ideas, backgrounds, skills. It sounds inherently healthy.
But Riker points out the actual Latin root of the word, right?
Yes. The root is diversus, which literally translates to turn in opposite directions. It fundamentally means conflict.
So when institutions say diversity is our strength, the book suggests they're basically saying conflict is our strength.
In practice, yeah. Riker argues that in the modern corporate context, diversity is simply a code word for an anti-merit quota system.
It specifically implies pushing out white men.
Because if a boardroom is 100% women, it's celebrated as completely diverse. But if it's 100% men, it's a crisis that needs intervention.
The word gets weaponized to punish competence.
Exactly. And then you look at the word inclusion.
This one is the most ironic to me.
Riker points out that inclusion in practice today actually means the ruthless exclusion of anyone who dares to disagree with the dogma.
If you question the narrative even slightly, you are not included. You are purged.
And we already covered equity, which is the forced equal outcome. But it's not just the vocabulary that's shifting, it's the method of enforcement.
Riker talks about female-coded enforcement.
Right. We've moved completely away from the concept of debate.
Where you'd say, I think your facts are wrong, here's my data.
Exactly. In a historically masculine framework, people debate facts. You can raise your voice, things can get heated, but ultimately the best data wins.
But in a female-coded framework, tone is the only metric that matters.
You could have the absolute truth on your side. You could have physics, math, peer-reviewed data, but if you present it aggressively, or if you make someone feel unsafe in the process, you instantly lose.
Tone policing over substance.
Riker calls this enforcement mechanism the GSR industrial complex.
GSR, gossip, shame, rally.
It perfectly encapsulates how the digital age operates. And again, Riker traces this back to evolutionary psychology.
Right, because historically, women didn't settle disputes with physical violence.
They fought with reputation destruction, they used gossip. The book cites data showing women gossip roughly 30% more than men on average.
Because in a small tribe or village, that was a crucial survival and social bonding mechanism.
If a man in the village of 150 people was dangerous, the women whispered, spread the word, and the tribe eventually ostracized him.
But today, we don't live in small villages, we live on the internet.
And that is the catastrophe Riker outlines. Social media has scaled the gossip, shame, rally mechanism to a global level.
A person in New York can initiate a gossip accusation against someone in London.
They shame him publicly on Twitter, rally a digital mob of millions, and completely destroy his career within 24 hours.
And there is zero due process.
None. There is no court of appeals for cancel culture.
And the book brings up a really heartbreaking case study for this, the Shirtgate scandal.
Dr. Matt Taylor. This is an example that Riker says perfectly illustrates the hostage situation.
Set the scene for the listener, because this happened a few years ago.
Dr. Matt Taylor was the lead scientist who landed the Rosetta probe on a comet.
Just think about the sheer math involved in that.
You are literally shooting a bullet from Earth and calculating the trajectory perfectly so it hits another speeding bullet millions of miles away in deep space.
It is an absolute pinnacle of human engineering and calculation.
A monumental achievement. But during a press interview about the landing, Dr. Taylor was wearing a shirt.
A bowling shirt, right?
Yeah, a slightly garish bowling shirt covered in comic book style pinup girls. And the kicker is, a female friend of his made it for him as a gift.
But the media machine, this GSR complex, completely ignored the comment.
They saw the shirt and went into overdrive. The headlines weren't about humanity touching the stars. The headlines were all, scientist wears sexist shirt.
They hounded him mercilessly.
They flayed him alive on social media until he broke. He had to go on live television, sitting right next to the data screens of his life's greatest achievement, and he openly wept.
He cried and apologized for his insensitivity.
Riker points to that image and says, "This is it. This is the triumph of the petty over the great."
It sends a message to every man watching that your merit, your genius, your hard work means absolutely nothing.
You could unlock the secrets of the universe, but if you offend the modern female aesthetic sensibility, the mob will force you to your knees.
It's the weaponization of safetyism.
And it feeds directly into what Riker calls the narrative machine and the believe all women dogma.
He dissects the Duke lacrosse case in this section too.
Which was a massive watershed moment for the culture. 3 college guys, completely innocent, accused of a horrific crime.
And the entire apparatus, the media, the university faculty, the newspapers, they all just decided the guilt was a foregone conclusion.
Because the facts didn't matter. The narrative was that men are the oppressors and women are the victims.
And when the DNA evidence fully cleared the players, the GSR mob didn't even apologize.
No, Riker points out they just pivoted. They used that classic cop-out and said, well, at least it started a conversation about campus culture.
Started a conversation. We ruined your lives, but it was for a greater good.
The book also brings up the movie The Red Pill by Cassie J.
Oh, this is a fascinating example because Cassie J was a feminist filmmaker.
Exactly. She set out to make a documentary exposing the men's rights movement. But as she actually interviewed these men, she realized they had valid, heartbreaking points about custody laws, workplace deaths, and male suicide.
And she documented her own ideological shift on camera.
But when the movie tried to screen in theaters, the GSR complex lost its mind.
They protested, pulled fire alarms, got theaters to cancel the showings.
Not because the movie contained falsehoods, but simply because it dared to humanize men.
And Riker proves that this dynamic spares nobody by pointing to J.K. Rowling.
Right. J.K. Rowling is a liberal, a feminist, a billionaire. She has immense structural power.
But the moment she stepped out of line and said biological sex is real, the revolution ate its own.
The GSR machine turned on her with the exact same ferocity they used on Matt Taylor. It proves that inclusion is a complete lie.
You are only included if you submit to every single tenet of the dogma without question.
So Riker lays out this diagnosis of the Munchausen state and the weapons of language and social control.
And then he moves into segment 3, institutional capture.
Because this war isn't just a bunch of people yelling on Twitter. It's happening inside the physical institutions that run our society.
From the classroom to the boardroom. Let's start with education, because that is where the ideological software gets installed.
Right. Riker details the shift in education from the classical trivium, which focused on logic, grammar, and rhetoric, to outright indoctrination.
He drops a staggering stat about higher education.
Women's studies programs outnumber men's studies programs in universities by a ratio of roughly 100 to 1.
Which guarantees a completely skewed ideological output from the universities.
But it starts way before college. The book talks about the war on math in public schools.
I remember seeing headlines about this out of California, the Oakland Unified School District.
Riker dissects their equitable math framework. The district essentially argued that demanding students show their work and arrive at a single correct answer, like 2 + 2 = 4, is actually a symptom of white supremacy culture.
I really need to pause on this. That just sounds too insane to be real policy. Are they actually claiming the math itself is racist?
Riker says they are attacking the very concept of objectivity.
Wow.
The framework argues that demanding precision creates a hierarchy where some students are smart and others are not.
And since the religion of equity demands equal outcomes, yeah, you have to dismantle the hierarchy of right and wrong answers.
Right, it's epistemological sabotage. Riker makes the point that you cannot build an airplane or a suspension bridge using feelings-based math.
No, the bridge will literally collapse.
But if you teach an entire generation that objective truth is just a colonial construct, you produce a generation that is functionally useless at maintaining a civilization.
They can only critique the society, they can't actually build it.
Add to that the pervasive safe space culture on college campuses.
Universities bringing in puppies during exam week to manage student stress, or providing coloring books for adults.
Riker ties this right back to the Munchausen mother. When you actively treat 20-year-old men like traumatized toddlers, you guarantee they will become traumatized toddlers.
You strip away their resilience, and then those students graduate and enter the corporate workforce.
Which brings us to the HR department.
Human resources. Riker explicitly calls HR the enforcement arm of the gynocracy.
He backs that up with a massive demographic stat. 78% of all HR managers are women.
78%.
That means hiring, firing, and corporate culture guidelines are overwhelmingly filtered through a female-coded lens.
And the most famous casualty of that environment has to be James Damore at Google.
The Google memo. Riker spends time analyzing exactly what happened there, and it's vital, listeners, remember the facts of that case.
Damore wasn't just writing some angry manifesto on a message board.
No, Google specifically asked for feedback on their diversity initiatives. Damore wrote an incredibly measured, thoroughly cited internal memo.
Using evolutionary psychology.
Yes. He cited peer-reviewed studies to suggest that the gender gap in tech might not be entirely due to systemic sexism.
He pointed out that, on average, men tend to be more interested in things and systems, while women tend to lean toward people and social dynamics, which is basic psychological consensus.
He was actually trying to solve the problem using logic, but he ran headfirst into the emotional dogma of HR.
He committed absolute heresy against the blank slate theory.
The idea that men and women are completely interchangeable in every way, and for that heresy, the enforcement arm fired him.
The book emphasizes he wasn't fired for his data being factually incorrect. He was fired because his facts made people feel unsafe.
Riker then looks at the tools HR uses, specifically unconscious bias training.
Which he argues is just used to pathologize normal male behavior.
It's essentially a corporate re-education camp. If a male employee is confident and assertive, the training tells him he's displaying privilege and needs to check his aggression.
But meanwhile, toxic female group behaviors are totally ignored.
Gossip, cliquishness, relational aggression, none of that is trained out of the workforce. It's just accepted. The system is custom designed to break male confidence.
And if the HR department doesn't ruin you, Riker says the legal system will finish the job. He titles this section Legal Lunacy.
Starting with the title NIEX Tribunals on College Campuses.
These are just terrifying parallel justice systems.
Completely devoid of due process. If a female student accuses a male student of misconduct, the university tribunals often deny the accused the right to legal counsel.
They even deny the right to cross-examine the accuser.
And the justification they use is purely emotional. They claim that cross-examination would re-traumatize a woman because she is too fragile.
So to protect her feelings, the man is stripped of basic constitutional rights. It's guilty because accused.
And this assumption of male guilt extends right to the local police department with the Duluth model.
This is a huge piece of the puzzle. What is the Duluth model?
It's a domestic violence policy framework that trains police officers to view domestic disputes purely through the lens of patriarchal power and control.
Meaning the system assumes the man is the oppressor by default.
Exactly. Even if the man is the one bleeding, even if he was the one who called 911 for help, the model dictates that because he holds structural power as a male, he must be the primary aggressor.
It totally ignores all the data showing reciprocal violence or women initiating physical violence.
It legally frames manhood as inherently criminal. And then, if a man enters the family court system,
It gets even worse.
Riker targets the tender years doctrine, which is the institutional relic that assumes mothers are just naturally better parents,
Mothers end up winning custody, I feel like 90% of the time.
leaving the divorced father reduced to the status of an indentured servant. The book describes how the courts force men to finance a household they've been kicked out of. paying massive chunks of their income to essentially rent time to see their own children.
It's an incredibly bleak picture. You get brainwashed in school, fired by HR, and bankrupted by the courts.
But Riker pushes it even further. In segment 4, he argues this isn't just an issue of fairness. He says it's leading to economic and biological suicide.
This is where the tone of the book really shifts from a sociological critique to a civilizational warning.
Let's break down the economic side first. Riker takes aim at what he calls the girl boss culture.
We've all heard the marketing stat that women control 85% of consumer spending.
They do control the spending. But Riker asks the crucial follow-up question: who is actually creating the surplus wealth?
Right.
When you look at tax data and you subtract all the government services consumed like welfare, healthcare subsidies, housing programs, Riker claims that women as a broad demographic group operate as net negative taxpayers.
Meaning they pull more financial resources out of the system than they contribute in taxes.
Correct. And the demographic putting the massive surplus into the pot are men, specifically men, working high risk, high output, physically demanding jobs.
So Riker frames the modern economy as a massive wealth transfer.
A wealth transfer from productive men to the state, which then redistributes those funds to women to subsidize their independence.
He calls it a Ponzi scheme of self-esteem.
The student debt crisis is the perfect modern example he uses.
Women hold roughly 66% of all student loan debt in America.
And Riker points out that a huge portion of this debt goes toward low return on investment degrees. Things like gender studies, sociology, the exact degrees that train you to work in the HR departments we just talked about.
So they take out massive loans to learn how to dismantle the patriarchy.
And then when they graduate and realize the economy won't pay them six figures for that skill set, they demand loan forgiveness.
They demand a bailout.
Which means demanding that the plumber, the HVAC technician, the truck driver men who skipped college and went straight to work pay the bill for the credentialed class.
But bad economics can theoretically be fixed. Riker argues the biological suicide is the truly fatal blow.
He calls it reproductive rebellion or the birth strike, and he refers to this strike as literal civilizational treason.
Because the birth rates across the West have absolutely collapsed.
Women in the West are averaging roughly 1.6 children. Population replacement requires 2.1. So mathematically, Western civilization is slowly dying out.
Now, the mainstream narrative always says people aren't having kids because it's too expensive.
Right, I can't afford a house, childcare is too high.
But Riker shuts that argument down by comparing Sweden and Hungary.
It's a brilliant comparison. Sweden is the ultimate feminist welfare state. Massive state-funded paternity leave, free daycare, gender-neutral policies everywhere.
And what's happening to their birth rate?
It's crashing. Money and subsidies didn't solve the problem.
And then you look at Hungary.
Hungary took a completely different approach. They aggressively promote traditional family structures.
They offer lifetime income tax exemptions for mothers who have 4 or more kids.
But more importantly, they culturally elevate the status of motherhood. And as a result, their birth rate started rising.
So it proves it's not a purely economic issue, it's a values issue.
It is entirely ideological. Riker argues that modern feminism relentlessly trains women to view corporate careerism as liberation and motherhood as a miserable burden.
Which brings us to a phrase in the book that is guaranteed to stick with listeners. He calls the "my body, my choice" slogan reproductive communism.
It's a provocative term. He explains it by saying that communism is essentially the privatization of gains and the socialization of losses.
Privatize the pleasure, socialize the consequences.
Exactly. Under this modern sexual ethic, women are encouraged to privatize the gains of hookup culture and sexual liberation. But if a pregnancy occurs, they demand the state, which again is disproportionately funded by male taxpayers, socialize the consequence by funding the abortion or the single mother welfare.
The book points out that 96% of Planned Parenthood's actual services are abortions.
It's not prenatal care. Riker argues it acts as a termination factory for the future population.
And this inevitably ties into the Great Replacement theory. Now, usually when that gets brought up, it's immediately dismissed as a fringe conspiracy.
But Riker doesn't frame it as a shadow conspiracy. He frames it as the simple, mathematically unavoidable consequence of feminist policy.
Walk us through his logic there.
If the native population is actively aborting its own children and rejecting family formation, the population shrinks.
But that Ponzi scheme economy we mentioned earlier requires a constant influx of new workers and consumers to keep the debt bubble afloat.
Exactly. So what is the only solution the state has left?
Open the borders and import millions of people.
Yes. But Riker points out the ultimate cosmic joke of this policy.
The culture clash.
Right. The state is importing millions of people from cultures that are deeply traditionally patriarchal.
So the feminist establishment is mass importing the exact brand of hypermasculinity they spent 50 years trying to eradicate domestically.
It's a suicide pact. The ideology is literally consuming its own future.
Okay, so we've laid out the entire hostage situation. The state is acting like a Munchausen mother, the institutions are completely captured, and the demographics are collapsing.
It's a lot to process.
We can't just leave the listener staring into the abyss. Segment 5 of the book is the Renaissance Roadmap. How do men actually fight back?
Riker is very blunt here. He says you cannot fight your way out of this.
The system is too captured.
The institutions are gone. You have to start by changing your own personal operating system. And step 1 is psychological warfare.
Men have to stop apologizing.
It sounds so simple, but in the era of the gossip, shame, rally mob, it's incredibly difficult. Men have been heavily conditioned to apologize for taking up space.
Apologizing for their privilege or for being assertive?
Riker says you have to totally reject the frame. When HR or the media accuses you of toxic masculinity, recognize that it is a hostile code designed to break you.
He uses the phrase, decode, don't debate.
I love that rule. If you try to logically debate someone using a borderline personality framework, you will lose. You just get sucked into their emotional vortex.
So you decode the vocabulary.
Right. When they say the word equity, you need to hear the word theft.
When they say diversity, you hear anti-merit.
When they say safety, you translate it to control. Once you clearly see the code, you stop trying to appease them and you just calmly say no.
He also gives readers a really powerful piece of scientific ammunition to use.
Yes, the gender equality paradox. Riker says every man should memorize this specific data point.
It's from a massive 2018 study published in Psychological Science.
Exactly. The study looked at the most aggressively egalitarian countries in the world, specifically in Scandinavia.
Places that have done everything possible to erase gender roles.
And the data showed that in those hyper-free societies, the occupational differences between men and women actually maximized.
When women are totally free from financial pressure, they overwhelmingly choose to be nurses and teachers.
And when men are totally free, they overwhelmingly choose to be engineers and system builders.
Biology completely trumps the ideology.
Riker says the blank slate theory is mathematically dead. Use the science as a weapon. Reality is undefeated.
But winning an argument isn't enough. Riker says we have to actively build parallel institutions.
This is the hard work. You aren't going to fix the Ivy League universities. You aren't going to fix legacy media or Hollywood.
You have to build new ones from scratch.
New schools that prize objective reality, new publishing houses, new payment processors that won't debank you for supposed hate speech.
He emphasizes bringing back the classical trivium for educating boys.
Teach them logic, rhetoric, and grammar so their minds are bulletproof against emotional indoctrination.
And I really appreciate that he grounds this renaissance in the physical body too. He tells the reader to deadlift your anger.
It's a profound metaphor, but it's also practical. He focuses on heavy weightlifting because the barbell represents absolute objective truth.
Gravity doesn't care about your feelings or your identity.
Exactly. You cannot identify as a guy who can deadlift 500 pounds. You either lock the weight out or it pins you to the floor.
The iron is completely honest.
And physical strength is the ultimate antidote to the Munchausen state. The state wants you weak, sedated, fat, and dependent.
So, becoming a strong, capable, physically dangerous man is an act of political rebellion.
Make yourself a hard target.
Finally, Riker touches on the spiritual and cultural restoration needed. He classifies wokeism as a fake, secular religion.
It truly functions like a cult. It has its own concept of original sin, which is whiteness or maleness.
It has confession, which is checking your privilege.
It has excommunication through cancel culture. But unlike traditional religions, it offers absolutely no path to redemption or forgiveness.
So what's the alternative he proposes?
A return to classical values, the true, the good, and the beautiful.
He urges men to reject the sheer ugliness of modern culture.
Look at brutalist modern architecture or deconstructed modern art. Riker says it is intentionally demoralizing and ugly.
We have to build things that are beautiful and worthy of lasting 1,000 years.
Riker's final piece of advice in the book is a gut punch. He says civilization is fundamentally a dominance hierarchy, not a debate club.
Be worthy of leading it.
That puts the ultimate responsibility squarely on the shoulders of the men listening. You can't just sit around complaining about the crazy mother anymore.
You have to grow up, take responsibility, and walk out of the sickbed.
Exactly.
I want to leave the listener with one last, highly provocative concept from the book, something to really mull over.
The missing stare phenomenon.
Yes. This completely exposes the hypocrisy of the captured institutions.
The missing stare is a term actually coined within feminist activist circles. It refers to a person, almost always a high-profile male feminist ally, who is secretly known to be a sexual predator.
Everyone in the social circle knows he's creepy. The women whisper about him to warn each other.
But because he loudly signals the correct political virtues, because he champions equity and feminism in public, the group never actually addresses him.
They don't fix the missing stare, they just quietly train everyone to step around it.
Riker uses this to prove that for all their performative screaming about protecting women and dismantling toxic masculinity, the movement consistently protects actual predators within its own ranks.
While simultaneously trying to destroy the lives of innocent men like Matt Taylor over a bowling shirt.
It's a massive contradiction, just like a movement that claims to fight for women's rights, but then completely erases the biological definition of the word woman to appease activists.
The house of cards collapsing under its own logical weight.
Listen, we have covered a massive amount of ground today, but we have barely scratched the surface of the raw data, the history, and the strategy in this text.
If you are tired of feeling like a hostage in your own culture, you need the actual field manual on how to escape.
You really do. I highly recommend you go to Amazon Kindle or Google Playbooks right now.
Search for Feminist Domestic Terrorism by Conrad Riker and buy the ebook.
Read the chapter on the temperance movement. Read the deep dive into the birth strike data. It will completely arm you for the cultural arguments you are facing every single day.
And make sure you go follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack.
He is doing the ongoing analytical work that the mainstream media absolutely refuses to touch.
If you want us to keep bringing you deep dives into the books and ideas that actually matter, hit that like and subscribe button right now.
We aren't going to stop digging into the truth.
Don't just listen to us talk about it, read the manual, reclaim the culture. We'll see you on the next one.